The residential school system. Defeated and debased, Indigenous peoples were footnotes in Canada's fin de siècle imagination. As Canada welcomed the industrial future, with railroads and factories and bourgeois culture, Indigenous people were imprisoned in reserves, their culture deemed a relic of anthropology to be mocked or mystified, but by no means respected. But what would Canada do with its Indigenous prisoners? It was never entirely clear whether the Canadian elite wanted to convert Indigenous people into agricultural laborers, preserve them as an industrial reserve army of labor, or simply let them die. Glenn Sean Coulthard argues persuasively that as Canada built its industrial capitalist base, it needed Indigenous land far more than Indigenous labor. Increased European settlement, combined with an imported, hyper-exploited non-European workforce, meant that, in the post-fur trade period, Canadian state formation and colonial capitalist development required first and foremost land, and only secondarily the surplus value afforded by cheap Indigenous labor. This is not to suggest, however, that the long-term goal of indoctrinating the Indigenous population to the principles of private property, possessive individualism, and menial wage work did not constitute an important feature of Canadian Indian policy. It did. The proletarianization of Indigenous peoples was secondary to their ghettoization and the permanent destruction of their will to resist the new state. Although the Canadian state used several different measures to accomplish these aims, none was as pervasive and pernicious as the infamous residential school system. The residential schools were so heinous that few contemporary Canadians will now defend them. And the radical cruelty of the apparatus around and within the schools was such that this history has forced a significant crack in the edifice of modern Canadian triumphalism. Most Canadians today know about the schools and view them as a shameful part of Canada's history. That assessment is true, but it is also narrow and limited. The schools were not a disgraceful aberration, but, rather, a single component of a broad and coherent colonial ideology and practice. Residential schools were not unique to Canada. Similar models with similar goals were applied in several settler colonial states, including Australia and the United States, which also established such schools in its own colonies, like the Philippines. Canada undeniably excelled in the dubious art of kidnapping Indigenous children and subjecting them to isolation, abuse, and traumatic cleavage from the world as they knew it. Though it may not have been the most significant factor in the near collapse of the Indigenous world, it was surely among the most cruel. The school system was part of the treaty negotiations on the Plains, and Canadian official Alexander Morris may never have said anything so accidentally honest in those discussions as when, negotiating Treaty 4, he told the assembled, "The Queen wishes her red children to learn the cunning of the white man, and when they are ready for it, she will send schoolmasters on every reserve and pay them." Negotiators on the Indigenous side often recognized that a Canadian education might prove valuable for their younger generations, and did not oppose the idea in principle, since they quite reasonably assumed that the schools would be set up in their communities and would supplement, not replace, their own systems of education. Indeed, these terms were clear enough in the treaties. However, as early as 1847, 2 decades before Confederation, the colonial agenda of the schools was clear. Egerton Ryerson, whose name is now given to a prominent Toronto university, asserted that any education for Indigenous children must consist not merely of the training of the mind, but of the weaning from the habits and feelings of their ancestors, and the acquirements of the language, arts, and customs of civilized life. The schools would ultimately be established to do just that. Teaching was in English, and corporal punishment was meted out liberally to students who spoke their own languages. Sexual violence and abuse were also prevalent and linked to high suicide rates, alcoholism, and drug abuse in survivors of the schools. By the early 1900s, as children were emerging from the nightmarish experience of the schools, Indigenous parents increasingly refused to send them. In 1920, the Indian Act was amended to make attendance at the schools compulsory, and the police and Indian Affairs would now be empowered to take children to the schools and keep them there by force. At its height, some 75% of Indigenous children aged 7 to 15 were in the schools. The education itself was minimally useful. The Eurocentric curriculum was jarring, and the Bible readings and histories of English kings was irrelevant and disconnected from anything Indigenous children knew. Students were actively taught that their own cultures were backwards and shameful. Their traditional clothing was burned, their hair was cut short, and they were called by European names. Given the students' youth, that they had been physically separated from their homes and that they constantly feared physical and sexual violence, it is no surprise that the schools were utterly traumatic and left people irreparably broken from their very sense of themselves. Many survivors emerged alienated from both their own communities and the white society that had broken them. The testimonies of survivors, many compiled during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings, are truly harrowing. The stories are so upsetting that I am often reluctant to share them in the classroom, my students sometimes leaving in tears. The schools were unsanitary, with raw sewage seeping into children's rooms. Students were experimented on by Canadian government researchers. Humiliation was rampant. Children who wet the bed would be forced to wear their soiled clothing all day, or pull down their pants and be lashed in front of the other students. Students who spoke their Indigenous language had needles stuck through their tongues. Many students were beaten into unconsciousness or even to death, in which case they were routinely deposited in unmarked mass graves. Children were sold into pedophile rings to be abused by clergy, police, and business and government officials. Girls who got pregnant after being raped had their infant babies murdered. One testimony from a school in Saskatchewan described a newborn baby being put into an oven and burned to death. These horrifying stories represent only a tiny fraction of the trauma inflicted and the long-term harm done. These are actions that can only be understood in a context where the perpetrators, and here I mean not just the individuals carrying out these actions, but the vast network of people committed to facilitating and justifying those actions, had fully accepted the idea that their victims were less than human. The last residential school was closed in 1996, though most were shut down by the late 70s. The long-term damage and dislocation done to Indigenous individuals and communities is difficult to measure, and would qualify, on its own, as evidence of Canada's attempt to destroy Indigenous civilization. What is more, Canadian officials at various points in the history of the system made its intentions quite plain in quotes that are now familiar to many Canadians. The Indians must disappear, quote, the Indians must disappear before the march of civilization, end quote, as Canadian writer Duncan George MacDonald. Said Canadian writer Duncan George MacDonald. Taking it further, Canadian poet and Department of Indian Affairs official Duncan Campbell Scott famously declared, quote, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our object is to continue here until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed by the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department, quote unquote. Unquote. John A. Macdonald, for his part, explicitly stated that, quote, the schools were designed to kill the Indian in the child, end quote. These are inescapably the words of people committing genocide. Following the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, there was no shortage of apologies from the Canadian government and from the various churches that ran the schools and were most directly responsible for them. But these apologies do not undo the damage, nor do they include significant measures for decolonization of Canada. Indeed, the tragedies of the residential school system are only one component of the systematic colonization imposed on Indigenous peoples. Even as the residential schools were falling out of fashion, Indigenous children were again being kidnapped in what came to be known as the 60s Scoop, a set of policies that emanated from the Social Democratic Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, CCF. In this case, children were taken not to boarding schools, but into the Canadian child welfare system, where they were fostered out to predominantly non-Indigenous families and, again, suffered extreme culture shock, trauma, abuse, and pointed shaming for their Indigenous heritage. This dynamic is no relic of the past. Laurie Gilchrist notes that another such wave, a millennium scoop, has taken place in the last 2 decades. In fact, by the late 2010s, there were more Indigenous children in government care at various stages of the child welfare system than were in the residential school system at its peak. Policing the colonized. Colonialism is inextricably linked to gendered and sexual violence. It was prevalent in the residential school system and in the more contemporary child welfare and foster care systems, a fact that still seems to shock modern Canadians. But it should not be so surprising. Sexual abuse of children in residential schools is only a small part of the story. European colonialism was endowed with an intensely patriarchal ideology that sought to control women's bodies and sexuality, channeling good women's sexuality into marriage and child rearing, while preserving bad women's sexuality for the sexual satisfaction of men. Silvia Federici argues that this was not merely coincidental to the rise of capitalism, but essential to it. Controlling women's bodies meant controlling the reproduction of the labor force, arguably the most important commodity in capitalism. Patriarchal values also sat neatly alongside the rest of the colonizers' ideological baggage: hierarchy, discipline, and exploitation, which were the hallmarks of settler capitalism. Notably, while Indigenous civilizations in North America prior to European contact possessed a range of attitudes around gender and sexuality, much evidence suggests that the kind of patriarchy and sexualized violence exhibited by the colonizers was extremely rare. Many Indigenous societies had considerably more egalitarian politics. Indeed, European conquerors were surprised by the degree of respect that even male warriors had for women. One English general remarked on the fact that Indigenous war parties did not use sexual violence against their enemies, a fact that seemed to surprise the Europeans, for whom such behavior had become normal. These patterns only began to change after centuries of relations with Europeans and, especially, as Indigenous societies were increasingly defeated and forced to assimilate. The earliest illustrations of this dynamic can be traced back to the efforts by the French Jesuit missionaries to convert Indigenous people in the 17th century. In a pattern that would be repeated time and again across what became Canada, the greatest resistance to Christian conversion and other forms of assimilation came from Indigenous women. One of the primary reasons for this was that Indigenous gender relations tended to be much more egalitarian than the strict patriarchal authority the Europeans sought to impose. Jesuits were perplexed that Indigenous women exercised control over many aspects of family and community life, that their labor was valued as much or more than that of men, that women shared amongst one another the responsibility of raising children, as opposed to their being raised in nuclear families, that women were empowered to overrule their husbands or even leave them without difficulty or shame, and that the norms around sexuality were very relaxed. The Jesuits were horrified by this power, economic, political, social, and sexual, that women possessed. In the 1630s, missionary Paul Lejeune wrote, quote, "The women have great power here. A man may promise you something, and if he does not keep his promise, he tells you his wife does not wish to do it. I told him that he was the master, and that in France women do not rule their husbands." End quote. Another Jesuit was shocked by the, quote, "debauches, indecent dances, and shameful acts of concubinage," end quote, he witnessed among Indigenous women, and yet another bemoaned the fact that Indigenous women refused to be controlled. Quote, "A young woman, they say, is master of her own body and free to do what she pleases," end quote. The missionaries sought to curb women's power by explicitly courting the men for conversion and then encouraging them to assert their will over their wives. Women, as a result, tended to be the most resistant to the changes being pushed by the missionaries and the fur trade. Carol Devins notes that, quote, "women declined conversion and stressed the importance of older rituals and practices," end quote, which were central to the existing social relationships. When one Jesuit preached the eternal fires of his hell, he reported that the women replied with sarcasm, quote, "that if their threats be well grounded, the mountains of the other world must consist of the ashes of souls," end quote. When the priests persisted in their efforts, some women brought the fires of hell upon them directly, as when Father Andre found his cabin torched. But women's resistance ultimately weakened as the pressures from the fur trade, or as the pressures of the fur trade and the growing incidence of disease and territorial encroachment made their communities more and more vulnerable. The gradual degradation of Indigenous society by European conquest was reflected in the diminishing position of Indigenous women. Thus, the patterns that were present in New France were in many ways replicated in the Canadian conquest of the West. Dakel, or carrier society, for instance, traditionally stressed gender equality. Clans were matrilineal, and age, rather than gender, tended to determine political authority. The gendered division of labor was flexible and gave advantage to men. The gendered division of labor was flexible and gave no advantage to men. In fact, women tended to organize and supervise that division of labor, and it was female elders who held the important role of storing and accounting for surplus production. This all changed gradually but decisively with the European contact in the 19th century. Whites promoted men into the role of chief and dealt exclusively with them, while missionaries established garrisons of coercive authority, magistrates, watchmen, soldiers, to enforce patriarchal Christian law. Shortly thereafter, the Indian Act formalized Canada's establishment of male colonial domination. Métis women came under particular pressure to conform to European gender roles, given their mixed-race heritage and the fact that Métis society more closely resembled that of the French. As such, even while other Indigenous women on the plains had retained some of their social status, Métis women at Red River were increasingly controlled, subject to domestic violence, and relegated to inferior status. Even still, their subjugation was by no means complete, and Métis women in the late 19th century recognized that their best chance lay in the struggle for Métis sovereignty and autonomy. Many were active participants in the armed resistance in 1870 and especially 1885. Marie-Anne Parenteau threatened that if the police attacked Batoche, she would, quote, skin them like meat, unquote. End quote. And many women manufactured homemade bullets using kitchenware and knives. Women had an impact on strategy, as when Marguerite Caron admonished Louis Riel for not sending troops to support Métis fires at Fish Creek. Okay, my French is going to be horrible. Si vous ne voulez pas aller, dites-le-moi, she said. Moi je vais aller. If you're not going to go, tell me. I will go. Riel acquiesced, and backup was sent to Fish Creek with success. Nevertheless, despite their courage, the Métis were ultimately overwhelmed by the massive force of 8,000 soldiers dispatched to destroy them, and the women had to flee the town to avoid the carnage that British soldiers unleashed. Those who did not escape were subject to indiscriminate violence and sexual violence. When they returned, it was to burned homes, destroyed crops, and dead husbands. It was the women of Batoche who bore the burden of rebuilding their society from the wreckage of Canadian patriarchal annihilation. Thus, not only did European conquerors actively work to undermine egalitarian gender relations in Indigenous communities, they also acted out of their own deeply rooted patriarchal values. The very idea of male domination over women presupposes that violence may be necessary to sustain it. No domination is ever uncontested. Sexual violence, thus, should not be understood simply as individual pathology, but as a behavior framed and made possible by the social milieu around which it takes place. European patriarchy always acquired a willingness to enact violence against women and anyone who undermined the gendered hierarchy that made women and their sexuality a commodity. Mapping that patriarchy onto colonialism, yet another system of hierarchy and domination, invariably made colonized women the targets of sexual harassment, abuse, and violence at the hands of colonizing men. Indeed, given the colonial emphasis on dominating its subjects in body and mind, colonialism makes for fertile ground for sexual violence and can be found all across the history and geography of European conquest. In addition to being a subconscious manifestation of the twin hierarchies of patriarchy and colonialism, sexualized violence serves multiple concrete objectives for the colonizer. It belittles its victims and their lives and cultures, undermining their sense of self and self-worth, while simultaneously seeking to demoralize the colonized, whose humiliation and defeat is amplified by the desecration of their bodies and those of the loved ones they could not protect. Not only does it inflict trauma and shame upon the colonized, it also reinforces the superiority of the colonizer, who revels in the power bestowed upon him by his racial gifts. In shaming colonized men and women, and reducing them to such brutal submission, the colonizing patriarch now sees before him the justification for his actions, viewing his victims as base, shameful, beneath dignity. To the colonizer, they are less than human, and the very fact that they submit to sexual violence is taken as evidence that they are sexually licentious. The act of violence produces the justification for it. Quote, everywhere around the world, argues Jean Jean Barman, Indigenous women are presented as an enormous dilemma to colonizers, at the heart of which lay their sexuality, unquote. In the early days of conquest, indigenous women were targets for colonizers' sexual gratification. But, especially as the settlement process got underway, this overlapped with a need to mark the racial and civilizational boundaries between them and their inferiors. Virtuous Victorian sexuality would be tainted by settler men indulging in sexual affairs with indigenous women, who were increasingly framed as prostitutes, even when the evidence suggested a much less formal relationship. The very fact that indigenous women expressed sexual agency in various ways was deemed a threat. They were tempting moral white men into sin, which served to reinforce the objectification of indigenous women. Thus, white men told themselves that indigenous women were beneath them and that their sexuality was sinful, thus establishing a context in which sexual violence could be framed as inevitable and blamed on its victims. European settlers in Canada applied this colonial attitude to indigenous women right from the start. It repeats itself again and again, in context after context, across the entire history of contact. Consider Henry Julien, one of the contingent involved in the 1874 march of the Northwest Mounted Police to conquer the West. In this, the arrival of the police to the prairies, Julien describes Sioux women in his diary. Quote, "The women, even the budding girls, have not a single feminine grace. The men must be hard up indeed who take such for a wife. And still, like their sisters the world over, these women put on airs. They have certain grotesque coquetry about them. They cast sheep's eyes at you and squint to see if you are admiring them." End quote. Fucking vile. Just fucking vile. Sorry, chat. I just gotta hit my vape here for a second, so. I just need a little help to cope with some of this fucking vile shit. To continue. The civilized European settler here asserts his dominance over the colonized woman. He declares her ugly, unfit to be a wife, possessing none of the grace of a white woman. At the same time, he insists that she is trying to tempt him with her grotesque coquetry, desperate for his white male approval. Consider now this remembrance from Howard Adams, Métis scholar who grew up in Saskatchewan in the 1940s. Hitchhiking to his job on a nearby farm, Adams was picked up by Mounties on the highway. Quote, "As we started up, the driver asked if I was from the Métis community, St. Louis, and before I had a chance to the other cop remarked, quote, There's a lot of smoked meat around that town, end quote. I heard that expression many times before, and I knew what it meant. The comment really burned me, but I was too scared to argue. As far as I was concerned, the girls in St. Louis were very decent. The Mountie continued, quote, I hear those half-breed babes like to have their fun laying down, end quote. I tried to change the subject, but the police were interested in pursuing it to the end. The driver asked in a marking manner, quote, is it true they like it better from a white man? End quote. I was getting really angry, while at the same time trying to explain that Métis girls were just as nice as white girls. They drove on with comments about, quote, red-skin hotboxes who didn't wear any pants at all, end quote, and kept calling me chief in a sneering manner. Although they seemed to have an obsessive interest in native girls, they were also implying that Métis girls were little more than sluts and too dirty for the Mounties. One asked, quote, is it true they'll go to bed with anyone for a beer? End quote. That is how the famous redcoats of Law and Order respect the native people in their society. The similarities in the attitude of these police, some 70 years apart, is striking, and the continuity in attitude is all more profound when one jumps forward another 70 years to find police encounters with Indigenous people in the 21st century that possess precisely the same logic. In 2012, when an Indigenous teenager went to the Kelowna police to report that she had been sexually assaulted, she was subjected to more than 2 hours of humiliating cross-examination from male officers at the station. Among the comments made by the interviewing officer were the following, quote, Were you at all turned on during this at all? Even a little bit? You understand that when a guy tries to have sex with a female and the female is completely unwilling, it is very difficult. Go over it again with me. How did you try to get him to stop? Did you scream no? Did you say get off me? Did you say this was rape? I need you to stop? Is one of the reasons you came up with this is because you thought you might get pregnant and you thought that you might need the pill? End quote. Just as the police in the previous two cases had done, the RCMP officer in Kelowna ascribed to the Indigenous youth a kind of distorted promiscuity that assumed it was not possible that the girl could have been coerced into sex, that she must have asked for it or enjoyed it. Yeah. A perma-gulag for the RCMP. These are just 3 cases from the Canadian West, chosen for the way they mark temporal bookends in Canadian history. There is overwhelming evidence that these colonial attitudes towards Indigenous women have been pervasive throughout. Tens of thousands of Indigenous women are victimized by violence every year in modern Canada. Indigenous women are killed at a rate 6 times higher than non-Indigenous women, and perhaps, most tellingly, they are 3 times more likely to be killed by a stranger. Lisa Monchalin has described the ways that in North American pop culture, just as in the Victorian era, Indigenous women are portrayed both as hypersexual temptresses and simultaneously as brutish, ugly squaws, and that these twin dehumanizations create the perception that Indigenous women are rapeable subjects. The notion that colonized women are acceptable targets for sexual violence is consistent in the history of colonialism, and as I illustrate in this book, throughout Canadian history. Latin American, African, and Asian women have all been victims of Canadian sexual violence. I'm picturing the cops bringing a dusty old footlocker out of storage whenever they get a new recruit. The newbies get exposed and acclimated to retro expressions of racism. It's not a dusty old footlocker. It's not even put away hidden. It's written up on the bulletin boards, and you get exposed to it from day one in training. Guaranteed. Yeah. Nothing illustrates this crisis better than the fact that thousands of Indigenous women have been murdered or disappeared since the 1980s, with more than half of that number occurring since the year 2000. The vast majority of these cases were subject to minimal investigation and received little attention in the Canadian media until activist pressure from Indigenous communities forced the issue into public discourse and led to the striking of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. As the inquiry report illustrates, poverty and precarity in Indigenous communities, itself a product of generations of colonialism, made the already rapeable subjects even more vulnerable to settler violence, and the presence of class-coded addictions among Indigenous people fed into colonial stereotypes and reduced public sympathy. In the context of such precarity, many Indigenous women became sex workers, giving white society yet another excuse to implicitly blame them for whatever violence they receive. The report concludes that Canada's treatment of Indigenous women constitutes genocide. Even before the Canadian government was willing to entertain the idea that this was a problem, Human Rights Watch produced its own report in 2013, specifically highlighting the murder and rape of Indigenous women in northern British Columbia, identifying not just that women were being killed, but that local settler authorities were complicit in the violence and were creating a climate of fear and vulnerability for the women. Women would be arrested for public intoxication, an offense committed by thousands of university students on most Saturday nights across Canada, and placed in cells where they would be attacked while guards watched. Indigenous sex workers were assaulted routinely and with impunity, since those committing the assaults were often police, judges, lawyers, and other officials. Indeed, the police in particular were involved in a litany of offenses, often involving both physical and sexual violence. One homeless Indigenous woman reported being raped in 2012 by 4 police officers who stole her underwear afterwards. This utterly cruel extra step was so common that community workers began carrying packages of underwear to distribute to homeless women. Nope, no gulag cold enough. The most infamous single case of such violence was that of Robert Picton, a suburban pig farmer who murdered at least 33, but as many as 68 women in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Picton had been arrested for trying to murder a sex worker in 1997, but the case was not pursued. As more and more women, many of them Indigenous, disappeared from Vancouver's downtown east side, Vancouver and family and community members tried in vain to generate a proper police investigation. They were repeatedly met with disdain and disinterest. The mother of one of the victims conducted her own investigation and actually directed police specifically to Picton's farm, where he was bringing his victims to rape and butcher them and feed them to his pigs. The police did not investigate and, indeed, didn't even log the information they had received. Picton was arrested a few years later on an unrelated firearm violation charge, which ultimately broke the case on the worst serial killer in modern Canadian history. The Picton case illustrated the extent to which Canadian society considered poor Indigenous women to be disposable. The disappearance generated little attention or investigation, even after some within the police had flagged that it seemed like the work of a serial killer, and the case only became well known when the sensationally horrific details were discovered. Of course, Indigenous men are also targets for police and settler violence. Shireen H. Razak addressed the problem in Dying from Improvement, a study of deaths of Indigenous people in police custody and the public narratives around them, from a study that I highlighted. From that study, I highlight 3 cases. Paul Alphonse was a 67-year-old Secwepemc. I am horribly saying this wrong. Secwepemc, residential school survivor, who died in police custody of pneumonia and blunt force trauma after being stomped so hard that several ribs were broken and he was left with a massive purple boot print on his chest. A jury found that Alphonse was a victim of homicide, but RCMP Constable Bob Irwin, who arrested Alphonse and was involved in a physical altercation with him shortly before his death, was not convicted. Frank Paul, a Mi'kmaq residential school survivor, was taken into custody by Vancouver Police Department for public drunkenness, but instead of being brought to the drunk tank, was taken to a detox center where he was dumped in an alleyway, where he died within hours of hypothermia and alcohol poisoning. Neil Stonechild, an Indigenous teenager, was arrested and beaten up by police in Saskatoon and taken to a location outside of the city, where he froze to death. His was one of dozens of deaths caused by these so-called starlight tours, a common enough practice that it had a nickname. This roll call of settler murder does not adequately capture the nuanced argument Razak provides in the book, which emphasizes not just the fact that these travesties of justice took place, but that they were the product of an entire apparatus of settler society that made them possible. In each of these cases, pressure from families forced the state to open official inquiries into the deaths, and in each case, the conclusions were that Indigenous people were hard to police, that conflict with officers was a result of a cultural chasm and misunderstanding that Indigenous people are a disappearing race whose bodies and minds are not equipped to manage modern life. That is, despite ostensibly investigating instances of state-sanctioned murder, the state concluded that ultimately there was nothing that could be done to prevent it. People die, as one prison guard said after a prisoner died in his cells. Police violence and sexual abuse of Indigenous people across Canada's entire history has been rampant and routine, facilitated by a broader state apparatus committed to rationalizing police actions and networks of settler media who could be trusted to shift most of the blame onto Indigenous peoples themselves. The criminal justice system into which Indigenous people were increasingly funneled was, itself, used as a tool to control and incarcerate them. Indigenous people are vastly overrepresented in the criminal system, prompting settlers to see them as inherently criminal and dangerous, when, in truth, there are a litany of structural, political, and economic factors that caused this overrepresentation. These range from racial profiling by police to lack of resources for legal representation to the ingrained racism of settler judges and juries. In many ways, these systems inherited the roles played by the Department of Indian Affairs and the residential schools in earlier periods. They demarcate lines between colonizer and colonized, a distinction often written directly onto the bodies of Indigenous people.